The winter of 1814 wrapped London in a pale hush of frost and candlelight. Inside the Montrose ballroom, 1,000 glittering lights burned above polished marble, their reflections trembling across crystal and silk. Laughter floated like perfume, light and false, while beneath the chandeliers, reputations were traded with the same precision as fortunes. Lady Charlotte Winsley stood near the far wall, her gloved hands folded, her smile fixed with delicate control. Her gown, though last season's fashion, carried a dignity that wealth could not buy. At 29, she had learned the fine art of appearing untouched by fear. Yet that evening, she was afraid of the whispers that had begun to coil through the crowd like smoke. Her fiancé, Mr. Henry Easton, was late. The orchestra played the third waltz, the one promised to them when the engagement had been announced only a fortnight earlier. Charlotte's mother, the widowed Lady Beatrice Winsley, adjusted her fan with restless flicks, her anxious eyes darting toward the door. Henry was a man of charm and ambition, his smile polished as his boots, his future secure if their marriage proceeded as planned. For Charlotte, his affection had seemed genuine, perhaps not a grand passion, but steady, respectful kind. Enough, she had thought, for happiness. Yet as the musicians began a new set, the butler entered with a sealed letter and the faintest tremor in his voice. It was addressed to Lady Charlotte. She recognized Henry's hand. The music blurred into silence around her as she read. The words were brief, formal, and final. "Forgive me, but circumstances have changed. I am to marry Lady Agatha Montrose, whose dowry ensures both her comfort and my family's stability. I trust you will understand." Her vision swam. The room tilted, the chandeliers seemed to shudder, and the murmurs began. Someone near her gasped softly. Another whispered, "He has chosen Agatha," and the tide of gossip rolled outward in merciless waves. Charlotte folded the letter and slipped it into her glove. Her face was calm, though her pulse beat like a trapped bird beneath her skin. The orchestra hesitated, then resumed, as though nothing had happened. But everything had. The polite world of London, so fond of etiquette and cruelty, had scented blood. The dowagers exchanged sympathetic smiles. The younger ladies hid their delight behind fluttering fans. One woman murmured, "How humiliating," and another replied, "Well, she was nearing 30. Each word struck like a stone. Her mother's voice reached her faintly. "Charlotte, we should leave." But Charlotte stood still, her gaze fixed on the grand staircase where Henry now appeared, arm in arm with Lady Agatha, radiant in pearls and new triumph. He did not meet Charlotte's eyes. His expression was practiced indifference. It was not anger she felt then, but disbelief, the slow, aching realization that she had been measured, weighed, and dismissed as unprofitable. The air around her tightened, her throat burned, yet she managed a curtsy to those who greeted her, a final act of dignity before the ruin settled in full. When she finally moved toward the door, her gown brushed against a chair, tearing the lace at her sleeve. The small rip echoed through her composure like a shot. A gentleman reached to assist, but she drew away with quiet grace. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice even. "It is only a thread." Outside, snow drifted against the carriages. The cold struck her face, sharp and clean, and for the first time that evening she could breathe. Her mother followed, wrapping her in a shawl heavy with lavender scent. "It seems, my dear," Lady Beatrice whispered, "that hearts are traded like coin in this world." Charlotte looked toward the street lamps glowing in the fog. "Then I shall have none to sell," she said simply. The carriage wheels turned over slush as they rode home through the silent city. Charlotte sat motionless, her gloved fingers clenched in her lap, the letter pressing against her palm like a wound that would not close. She did not cry. Grief, she discovered, was not always noisy. Sometimes it was a stillness so deep it hollowed the soul. She thought of Henry's laugh, the promises spoken in candlelight, the plans they had drawn in hopeful tones. All of it gone, traded for a heavier purse and a grander name. Somewhere in her chest, something fragile withered. At the Winsley townhouse, The servants received her in uneasy quiet. The fire in the drawing room had burned low. Charlotte removed her gloves, placing them neatly on the mantel, and stared at her reflection in the mirror above it. Her face looked unchanged, still composed, still lovely, but she no longer recognized it. Behind her, her mother poured wine with trembling hands. "You must not despair, Charlotte. Another suitor will come." Charlotte's lips curved in a faint, weary smile. "I think not, Mama. I have nothing left they might desire." Her voice carried no bitterness, only a kind of exhausted truth. Later, in her chamber, she unpinned her hair and let it fall loose for the first time in years. The silence pressed close, broken only by the ticking of the clock. On the writing desk lay the letter again, creased and stained from where her glove had dampened it. She read it once more, not for meaning but for finality, and then placed it into the fire. The flames consumed the paper quickly, leaving only ash and the faint scent of ink. She whispered, "So be it." Outside her window, snowflakes drifted across the rooftops, soft as feathers. Somewhere in the fog below, the bells of St. Martin's tolled midnight. In that quiet, a new resolve began to form. Not fierce, not vengeful, but enduring. She would live without the illusions that had betrayed her. She would become her own steadiness, her own shelter. The world could gossip, men could barter affections for coin, but she would remain unbent, untouchable. In the street, a lone carriage passed, its lamps dim through the mist. For an instant, Charlotte thought she saw a figure watching from within. A man, his face obscured by shadow, his gaze fixed on the lit window of her room. Perhaps it was a trick of the light, perhaps not. The carriage moved on, swallowed by the fog. Charlotte turned from the glass and closed the shutters, drawing the curtains tight. Tomorrow would come, and she would rise again, quieter but unbroken. Tonight, she allowed herself the grace of silence and the comfort of not being seen. The morning sun filtered weakly through the gauzy curtains of Lady Charlotte Winsley's parlor, turning the faded roses on the wallpaper a delicate blush. 3 years had passed since the night her world had shattered in the Montrose ballroom, yet its echoes lingered in her mind like a melody she could never forget. Time had not erased the pain, but had taught her endurance, the quiet, unsung kind that leaves its mark not on the face, but in the soul. Her once vibrant spirit had cooled into calm strength. Her laughter, rare now, carried depth instead of lightness. London had changed, and so had she. Society, ever hungry for novelty, had long since found new scandals to feed upon. Charlotte had faded gracefully into its margins, neither disgraced nor celebrated, merely forgotten. She lived modestly in her late father's house with her mother, her life measured in tea hours and charity visits, in the tender tending of her small rose garden. There was a peace in obscurity, she had learned, though it was a peace tinged with loneliness. At night, when the wind whispered against the window panes, she sometimes wondered if love itself had been a dream, too fragile to survive the weight of reality. It was on such a morning, quiet and unremarkable, that fate began to stir once more. A letter arrived sealed in dark blue wax, bearing the crest of the Duke of Hawthorne. Charlotte's fingers hesitated before breaking it open. The Duke, Alexander Hawthorne, was a man whispered about even in her circle of reduced acquaintances. Wealthy beyond measure, widowed, too young, he was said to live in solitude at his country estate, Hawthorne Hall. Some called him cold, others noble. Most agreed he was dangerous in the way powerful men often are, untouched by the opinions of others. The letter was brief yet precise. My late wife supported the education of orphan girls through your charitable efforts. I wish to continue her legacy. Might we meet to discuss this endeavor? It was signed in a hand bold and elegant, without flourish or pretense. Charlotte read it twice, the weight of his name pressing into her thoughts. A duke requesting her counsel was not merely unusual, it was unprecedented. Still, the cause he mentioned had long been her solace. With careful composure, she penned a reply. I would be honored, your grace. You are welcome at Winsley House at your convenience. Asterisk. When he arrived 3 days later, the house seemed to shrink around his presence. Alexander Hawthorne was not a man easily overlooked. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a bearing that spoke of command rather than privilege, he carried himself with the stillness of one accustomed to silence being his ally. His eyes, gray as winter seas, took in the room, and then her, not with curiosity, but with a quiet kind of understanding. He bowed slightly. "Lady Charlotte." "Your Grace," she replied, lowering her gaze just enough to show courtesy without submission. Their conversation began with the expected courtesies, yet beneath the surface ran an unspoken tension, an awareness of two people who had both known loss, though in different forms. He asked about her charity work, and she spoke of the girls she taught letters and music to, her voice warming as she described their laughter, their small victories. He listened, not politely, but intently, as though every word mattered. "You have built something rare," he said at last. "Something not even titled men can claim. Purpose." Charlotte felt her composure tremble for the briefest moment. Praise was something she had not received in years, and from a man of his stature, it stirred emotions she did not wish to name. "It is not grand work, Your Grace," she said softly. "Only what must be done." "Perhaps," he replied, his gaze steady. "But the world is changed more by quiet hands than by loud hearts." That afternoon marked the beginning of an unexpected correspondence. Letters passed between them, discussions of funding, philosophy, books. Yet beneath the ink and formal tone, a warmth began to grow, cautious but undeniable. He wrote with intelligence touched by melancholy. She replied with grace shaped by resilience. Over time, their exchanges deepened into something neither dared to define. Months later, when she visited Hawthorne Hall for the first time, she found it as imposing as the man himself, stone and ivy, surrounded by wild gardens that refused to be tamed. Inside, however, there was a sense of quiet mourning, portraits draped in shadow, hallways lined with silence. The Duke greeted her with a small, rare smile. "You bring life into this place, Lady Charlotte," he said. "I'd almost forgotten what sunlight felt like indoors." As the days unfolded, their companionship grew into an unspoken understanding. He showed her the library, vast and dust-scented, filled with forgotten letters and maps. She spoke of her students and their dreams. Slowly, she began to see the man behind the title. Not the cold Duke society gossiped about, but a soul wearied by solitude. His late wife, he confided one evening, had died 5 years earlier in childbirth. "Since then," he said quietly, "I have learned that love can both heal and destroy, and that silence often does the same." Charlotte met his gaze. "Silence can protect," she said, "but it can also imprison." He studied her for a long moment before replying. "Then perhaps we are both captives of our own making." The admission hung between them, fragile and profound. For the first time in years, Charlotte felt the faint stirring of something she had buried long ago. Hope. Yet even as it bloomed, fear followed close behind. She knew what society would say if her name became linked to his. A woman once jilted by a fortune hunter and now favored by a duke? The whispers would rise again, cruel and familiar. Still, she found herself returning to Hawthorne Hall, each visit longer than the last. She began to notice the small things, how he lingered at the door when she left, how his letters grew less formal, how his laughter, rare and quiet, seemed to echo only when she was near. It frightened her, this slow rekindling of affection, for she had once believed love a luxury she could no longer afford. One evening, as they stood in the winter garden, frost glimmering on the roses, he said softly, "Charlotte, there are those who live for duty and those who live despite it. I wonder which of us is which." She looked up at him, her breath visible in the cold. "Perhaps," she said, "we are both trying to remember how to live at all." For a moment, the world seemed still, snowflakes drifting, heart silent. Something unspoken passed between them, neither promise nor confession, but the beginning of both. And yet, As Charlotte's carriage rolled away that night, a shadow of unease followed her. Affection was dangerous. The last time she had trusted her heart, it had been shattered. She told herself she would not fall again. But when she looked back toward the faint glow of Hawthorne Hall in the distance, she knew the truth her mind refused to speak. Her heart had already begun to turn toward him, helplessly, like a rose to the sun. Winter lingered longer than expected that year, as though reluctant to yield to spring. The frost clung stubbornly to the stone steps of Hawthorne Hall, and so too did Charlotte find herself clinging to the illusion of calm, to the comfort of duty, to the belief that her feelings for the Duke could remain unspoken. Yet beneath every polite exchange and carefully measured glance, her heart betrayed her. What began as admiration had deepened into something she could neither deny nor confess. She saw him often now, under the pretense of discussing their charitable ventures. They reviewed reports, debated philosophies, walked the frosted gardens, but their words carried meanings beyond what was spoken. When he stood near her, she felt his quiet strength like warmth radiating through the cold. When he looked at her, it was as though he saw not the faded woman society had discarded, but the one she once had been, the dreamer, the believer. One evening, as twilight painted the library in shades of amber and gray, he offered her a glass of wine. "You are quiet tonight," he said, studying her with that steady, discerning gaze. Charlotte hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Perhaps I have spoken too much lately. My thoughts prefer silence." He stepped closer, his tone softening. "And what do those thoughts tell you, Lady Charlotte?" Her eyes flickered toward the fire. "That I have lived my life fearing happiness. Each time it neared, I turned away, as if to want it were a kind of arrogance." He regarded her for a long moment before replying. "You mistake courage for arrogance. To desire joy after pain is the bravest act of all." Something in his voice, gentle yet resolute, unraveled the composure she had built over years. She looked up, their eyes meeting in the half-light. There was no grandeur in that moment, no music, only the quiet pulse of truth between two souls who had forgotten how to reach for warmth. Yet before either could speak further, the door opened. The sound of laughter broke the spell. A woman entered, tall, elegant, dressed in silk the color of moonlight. "Alexander," she said brightly, her voice tinged with familiarity, "you have been impossible to find these past months. I feared you'd vanished into your books again." Charlotte rose at once, composure returning like armor. The Duke's expression changed, ever so slightly, a flicker of irritation quickly masked. "Lady Davenport," he said, "you're always welcome." Lady Davenport turned to Charlotte, her smile polite but sharp. "And you must be Lady Winsley. I have heard so much about your good works." The pause before good works was calculated. Charlotte inclined her head gracefully. "You're kind to say so." The conversation that followed was courteous yet brittle, every word a dance of social precision. Charlotte sensed the woman's familiarity with Alexander, an old friend, perhaps more, and though the Duke remained perfectly civil, his silence spoke volumes. When at last Charlotte took her leave, the air outside felt colder than before. That night, sleep eluded her. She told herself her reaction was foolish, that she had no claim upon him, that she was too old to entertain jealousy. Yet beneath those reasoned denials lay a wound newly opened. She realized then that love, once awakened, is not easily silenced. Days passed before she heard from him again. The letter was brief. "You are missed at Hawthorne Hall. Will you visit once more before spring? There are matters I wish to discuss." The words, restrained as always, stirred hope and apprehension alike. When she arrived, the estate was alive with preparations for a ball. Lady Davenport's doing, she soon learned. The Duke, reluctant host though he was, had yielded to her insistence. "She believes my halls too quiet," he said dryly as he greeted Charlotte. "I suspect she hopes to fill them with laughter, or perhaps gossip." Charlotte smiled faintly. "Then I shall endeavor to give them neither." He looked at her then with something like longing, subtle, fleeting, but unmistakable. "You could silence a room without saying a word, Charlotte, and they would call it grace." The evening of the ball shimmered with opulence. Chandeliers burned like captured stars, gowns swept across polished marble, and violins wove through the hum of voices. Charlotte, dressed in muted blue silk, felt almost like a ghost among the glittering crowd. She had not attended such an event in years, and the whispers, soft but cruel, followed her like shadows. The spinster of Winsley House, the jilted lady, the Duke's new charity. But when Alexander approached, the room seemed to still. He offered his hand, formal and calm, yet the slightest tremor betrayed what lay beneath. "May I have this dance?" She hesitated, aware of every gaze upon them, every whisper waiting to rise. Then, quietly, she placed her hand in his. The orchestra swelled, and they began to move. His touch was steady, respectful, yet there was a current of emotion that words could never contain. Around them, the ballroom blurred into color and sound, but between them, time itself seemed to falter. "You should not have asked me," she murmured. "And yet I did," he replied, his eyes never leaving hers. "Because I no longer care who watches." Her breath caught, not from surprise but from recognition, the same defiance she had once longed to feel. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe in the impossible, that love, even so late in life, could still find her. But as the music ended, Lady Davenport's voice cut through the air. "My, how charming," she said with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "One might almost forget, Alexander, how little time you've spent in society since Eleanor passed. I dare say London will have quite the story to tell." The crowd's murmurs flared like kindling. Charlotte's composure held, but inside she felt the old humiliation return, the sting of judgment, the weight of whispers. She curtsied gracefully, excused herself, and slipped into the cool night beyond the hall. Moments later, footsteps followed. "Charlotte, wait." She turned. He stood in the doorway, the glow of the ballroom behind him. "You owe them no explanations," he said. "You owe me none." "I owe myself caution," she replied softly. "I cannot endure another ruin, Alexander. Not for whispers, not for pride, not even for love." His face softened with pain. "And yet, if it were love, would it not be worth the ruin?" The words hung between them, heavy and dangerous. She could not answer. With trembling composure, she stepped back, her voice breaking into quiet resolve. "Perhaps for others, but I am too old to be rescued, Your Grace, and too wise to hope." Then she turned and walked away into the darkness, leaving him alone beneath the flickering torches, his hand half raised, his heart, for the first time in years, unguarded and uncertain. Spring arrived gently, as though the earth itself feared to disturb what winter had left undone. In London, the air grew softer, the river glimmered with morning light, and flowers bloomed against the black iron fences like shy declarations of hope. But in Lady Charlotte Winsley's heart, no such thought had come. Weeks had passed since the ball, since the Duke's words had unsettled her so deeply. And though life continued with its quiet routines, she carried within her a silence more profound than ever before. She threw herself into her work with the orphanage, her hours consumed by tasks that required diligence but not emotion. Yet even as she read to her girls or oversaw their lessons, she found her mind straying, back to the library at Hawthorne Hall, to the way he had said her name, to the sorrow in his eyes as she walked away. Letters arrived from him at first, 3 in total. They were not pleading, nor dramatic. They were written with restraint, the kind only a man deeply wounded could muster. Asterisk, I meant no harm, Charlotte. Only truth. But perhaps I spoke too plainly. Asterisk another read. Asterisk, your absence has silenced this house. I did not know how much light you carried until it was gone. Asterisk, she read them in the privacy of her room and answered none. Her pride forbade it. Her fear demanded it. Then, one morning, she learned he had left England for the continent. Italy, her mother mentioned casually over tea. A warmer climate suits men who grieve too deeply, I suppose. The words stung, though Charlotte only smiled faintly and said nothing. Something within her wilted that day, not from rejection, but from the haunting sense of having let something rare slip through her fingers. Months passed. The summer sun turned the city golden, and Charlotte's charity flourished, thanks in no small part to the funds the Duke had quietly left in her trust before departing. Each coin carried his memory, his signature etched invisibly upon her days. She told herself she was content, that her work and her quiet life were enough. Yet sometimes, as dusk fell and the world hushed, she would sit by the window and whisper into the stillness, "I hope he found peace." It was in October, under skies bruised with rain, that fate returned once more. The post arrived late that evening, and among the bills and correspondence lay an envelope marked with a foreign seal, Hawthorne's crest, stamped in deep red wax. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The letter was brief. Charlotte, I return to England within a fortnight. My estate has need of repair, but it is my heart that is most in want of restoration. If I am still remembered kindly, I ask only for a conversation. One last asterisk. For days, she wrestled with the decision. Pride urged her to remain silent. Her heart whispered otherwise. In the end, it was not longing that decided her, but regret. She had spent too many years running from pain, first from betrayal, then from hope. Perhaps, she thought, it was time to stop running. The journey to Hawthorne Hall felt both familiar and foreign. The fields were touched with the colors of autumn, amber, crimson, gold, and the wind carried the scent of rain and wood smoke. When her carriage stopped before the grand entrance, she hesitated before stepping out. The doors opened before she could summon courage. The butler, older now, bowed deeply. "His Grace is in the garden, my lady." The garden? Of course. That wild, untamed place where roses bloomed despite the frost. She found him there, standing beneath the old oak, his coat dark against the fading light. He turned at her approach, and for a heartbeat, time seemed to forget itself. He was thinner, his hair touched with more silver, yet his presence, calm, commanding, quietly magnetic, remained unchanged. "Charlotte," he said, his voice low, carrying both surprise and relief. "Your Grace," she replied, though her tone was softer than formality required. They stood for a moment without speaking, the wind stirring leaves around them like whispers of the past. Finally, he said, "I did not think you would come." "Neither did I," she admitted. "But you asked for a conversation, and I have grown weary of silence." He smiled faintly. "Then I'm already in your debt." They walked slowly through the garden paths, speaking at first of ordinary things, the weather, the state of his estate, her school. But as the light waned, their words grew more honest, less guarded. He told her of Italy, how he had wandered through ruined villas, searching for peace and finding only reflection. "It is strange," he said quietly. "The farther one runs from pain, the more faithfully it follows." "And did it follow you?" she asked. His gaze met hers, unwavering. "Everywhere. Until now." Her heart quickened, but she held his gaze. "You were not meant to live alone, Alexander." "Nor were you," he replied. "And yet, we both made solitude our virtue." He stopped then, facing her fully. "I've spent my life building walls of dignity and restraint, believing they would keep me safe. But in truth, they only kept me from living. You once said silence can imprison. You were right. I have been my own jailer." She tried to speak, but emotion caught her throat. He continued, his voice breaking just slightly. "Charlotte, I have nothing to offer you but honesty. My name carries power, but it means nothing without peace, and you are my peace. If you cannot love me, I shall understand. But if you feel even a shadow of what I feel, then I ask you, not as a duke, but as a man, let us begin again." Tears welled in her eyes, unbidden. "You would take me still, after all these years? After all the whispers?" He stepped closer, gently taking her hand. "The world has whispered all its life. Let it. I have listened to too many voices but my own. This time, I choose differently." For a long moment, she could not answer. Memories flashed before her. The betrayal that once defined her, the lonely years that followed, the cold nights she convinced herself love had ended for her. And now, Here stood a man who had seen her not as broken, but as whole. Slowly, she lifted her gaze. I have been afraid to hope, Alexander, but you have given me reason to try once more. His expression softened with relief, and in that instant, the years seemed to fall away. The rain began to fall lightly, glistening on the roses. He raised her hand to his lips, his voice a whisper. Then let this be our beginning. She smiled through her tears. Not a beginning, she said softly. A continuation of all that should have been and all that might yet be. They stood together beneath the rain. The world hushed around them. In the distance, the bells of Hawthorne Village began to toll, marking the hour as dusk settled fully upon the land. It was neither an ending nor a simple renewal. It was something rarer. Two lives, once fractured, mending not through passion's flame, but through the quiet courage to believe again. And when the Duke finally drew her into his arms, not as a rescuer, but as an equal, their silence was no longer a prison. It was a promise,